So let's go ahead and get started identifying the major shapes in these references. I decided to go ahead and choose references that would be easy and difficult, and then also err on the side of shapes rather than forms or vice versa, so that you would be able to do this easily on your own and not have the same dilemma when the math teacher does the easiest assignments in class and then gives you the hardest ones for homework. So now we're in Procreate, and I'm starting off with this guy here. He's a good mixture of shape versus form, and he kind of is heavy on the shape since he's in a profile view here. So his head is basically this shape here, and this will be a little bit easier to understand if you've already studied head shapes, but really what's going on, just as a kind of quick refresher, is you have the circle here like this, and then you have the triangle coming down like that. And then what you do is you simply round those edges to form out the jaw and then the features of the face that extend from the head. But when we look at the rest of his body, you really want to kind of simplify it into a shape rather than a form, because it's such a, almost a perfect profile view. So what I'm going to do here is identify this triangle like this that basically makes up his entire body. But what we're going to want to do is smooth out these sides like that. So it kind of becomes this like halfway ellipse, just so we can start to get a feel for the proportions of his figure. And then we can have the hoodie here. So again, let's see, we can basically simplify this into a triangle again. Triangles are some of my favorite forms to use to simplify, but I'm actually just gonna make that a square like that. And then if we go down here, his legs, not too much form to them really. I think if you were to make this a drawing, you could just not draw the other leg and it would look fine. So what I'm going to do here is just represent this as a triangle with a tapered edge like this. And then so I'm going to extend this line down here, and then I'm going to do the same thing with his feet. So his feet, I'm already noticing there's an interesting shape going on here with this part of the design. So I'm just going to represent that as one triangle, and then come down here, bring this down for the sole of his foot, very key part of this design. And then I'm just going to draw a rectangle like that. And so what I've done is I've broken this down into a very simple diagram so that you can easily understand the proportions, so that if you want to go back to this, you want to draw a half cut or a halfway cut ellipse, then you want to draw just a rectangle coming down and then just extend that into some really basic shapes. And so it'll be easy for you to draw this without getting the head too small, too big, or the legs too long or too short. Now this one is going to be quite a bit of a step up from the last one, since she's in perspective and she's sitting down. So there's a lot to go with here, and I also selected this one because I really wanted to emphasize form here, since most of her clothes are very tight fitting, and we can see a lot of her legs and her shoulders. It's going to be easy to see these rounded forms. So I'm going to go straight into her thigh here, and the easiest way to understand this is to look at it as a cylinder. So I'm going to draw the top end of the cylinder here, and I'm going to increase the opacity of my brush here so that we can see it. And so this is kind of facing this way towards the knee. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this curve back as we see it flowing along her thigh there, and then just round it out like that. And so what we're doing is we're trying to visualize this part of her leg as a cylinder, but what we do know but we can't see here as she's sitting is it comes back and it fits into her pelvis. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw this shape here and visualize another end of the cylinder that's actually coming back into her pelvis. And so if I were to draw this strictly as a cylinder, there would be two straight lines here like this, but then I'm adding some of the curve here like that. So when I'm sketching this afterwards, I can start with the basic cylinder and then come back and add the curves. As for her knee, I'm just going to do that as a sphere. That's how I like to do this for a lot of these portraits or characters that I'm drawing. And then I'm going to do the same thing with her, with the rest of her leg. I'm going to identify a cylinder here. This is kind of a cross section of how the cylinder is going, and that part is going that way. And then I'm going to draw a cylinder that would connect at the center point to the corner of this sphere that I have here. And then I'm just going to connect the lines like that. And so you can see this cylinder extends and grows bigger as it goes closer to the knee. And so when you do this, this would be easy for you if we hide the reference again. it would be easy for you to kind of understand these basic shapes, much easier for you to break it down. And then you can start to add in the details when you look at this and compare it to your reference. You're like, okay, I can see here the flesh is coming out here because of a muscle, and then it's coming back closer in when it gets closer to the joint, and it's very tight against the knee. And so you're able to really start teaching yourself actually what makes, you know, the body different from just a stick figure as you begin to do these studies. And so when we come up here, we're going to zoom out a little bit, and we're going to try to understand her upper body as it's going back in perspective. So what's going on here is there's a top part to her torso. And so I'm going to try to identify that with you here. This may not be as evident, which is why you'll hear me say later in the video that it's good to study some anatomy. You know, don't completely neglect it, because the more you learn, the more this kind of exercise is going to be intuitive for you. And so this is really the top of her shoulder, or the top of her torso here. And then we have this mass up here that brings up her neck. And so what we can do is I can simplify this and kind of imagine that this is where the base of her neck is. And then I'm going to kind of draw this softened pyramid shape that comes down like that. So I'm going to draw it like this. And you can kind of imagine that this is how the top of her torso is. And then as we come down, what we're seeing is, if we cut the arms off like this, what we're seeing is a shape. And I'm going to draw a circle there to imagine that's where her arm would connect. Is we're seeing a shape come down like this, and it's tapering inward just because of simple anatomy, but it's also tapering inward because that's going back closer to the end of the chair. And so we know, you know, her waist is going to have the cross section of an ellipse. So we're going to draw that in right there. And then we're going to try to visualize this as a shape that starts out as an ellipse like this. And then it grows into a bigger ellipse that becomes the base of this rounded pyramid shape here. So if you were to visualize this, the lines would come down her bust like this, and then curve back. And then back here, it would curve back like that. Maybe not so extreme, but I'm just emphasizing that there is a spinal curve at the back there. And so you can think of this shape as kind of a simple rectangle, actually, like a rectangular prism or a pyramid that's been chopped off at the top and bottom. And so that's how you really want to think of that shape. And so if we do that here, that's a very complex version. But again, you know, it's really all based off of very basic shapes that you just kind of substitute different basic forms, that you substitute different shapes at the tops and bottoms of it. So this is really just a cylinder that's been replaced with ellipses of different sizes at the top and bottom. Here's another one that's very similar. I tried to find some references that had less clothes so that you could really understand these forms of the legs. So let's start off with the easiest part of her ankle that's going into her shoe here. You can see that that's kind of how this cylinder would be. I hope you can start to visualize this. And then that's where that cylinder would be there. And then when it comes to her knee again, sometimes what I like to do is I'll do this right here. So I'll completely ignore the knee as a joint, and I'll just kind of draw this right here, as that's where the cylinder would start. And so this edge would be thick, and I'm drawing this so that you know that it's on the surface, and then this would be behind the surface of the knee that we're seeing there. And so again, I could choose to draw a straight angle here, but if I'm getting used to it, I can just go ahead and draw in the curves so that I can understand how this cylinder is beginning to flow and modulate itself. And when we go into the shoes again, this is also something that I tend to do a lot because it's tricky to draw shoes in perspective like this. So what I'll do is I'll use this angle of the cylinder or the ellipse to help me get an idea for what I want the shape of the shoe to be. So basically what's going on here is we have the shape of the shoe is a simple rectangular prism like this. So I'm going to draw that prism in. Like that. And it's basically like that. But we have the top of the shoe as well. So what's happening here is I'm going to draw a little square right here in the same perspective or similar perspective as her ankle is going into the shoe. And then that square is going to come straight down like that for the shoe. And so now if we focus or hide the image below, if we draw the shoe with these constraints in, knowing that the shoe is going to fit into this little blocky shape, we're going to get it in the right perspective, and it's going to look a lot better than if we might have been confused earlier on. I've also done this in a drawing that you're going to see me do later, where I drew the shoe flat and at the completely wrong perspective, but doing this beforehand can really help you avoid that mistake. And again, we're not tracing what's just the lines that are there. We're trying to find the perspective, find the basic forms that make up the shape. And so now going forward, we know, okay, the shoe doesn't exactly follow these lines. It kind of curves like this down here. So I'm going to kind of take this line here and curve it again. And so now we're teaching ourselves what's there. We're teaching ourselves to see what's really there, but at the same time, making sure we pay attention to what we see and not what we think we know. And always, as we are doing this, we're increasing what we know to be actually accurate so that we can draw better freehand in the future. So with this part of the knee here, I'm going to go back to the other way I draw the knees, which is just doing a sphere. And I'll draw a cylinder here. This is facing towards us, so I hope you can see what's going on here. This would be the bottom of the sphere. That's like a line going through it. And then that line would touch the center of this ellipse that would form the top of this cylinder here that we're going to draw. Just draw a straight line like this. And then here, this is a really interesting one. So you kind of have to visualize. This is going to be a foreshortened cylinder. So we see it connects to her pelvis right here with a really big ellipse right there. And then with a smaller one as it gets closer to the knee that we pretty much can't see at all because the sphere is in the way. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw those two ellipses and I'm going to connect them going along the curve of her thigh right there. And so we can pay attention to this. If we draw a straight version, it's like this, but we see, okay, there's a little bit of fat, a little bit of muscle that's coming back around, that's giving her that shape right there. So that really helps us out. And with this one, with the underwear that she's wearing or bikini, I'm not sure what it is, but it really helps us visualize these forms here. So you can see it's almost exactly where I would naturally divide up this section here. So the hips, I like to divide like this, always coming down towards the crotch like this, and then emphasizing this shape again for the cylinder like this. And then you see at the top here, it starts off her waist. And so we can see that's going to be the starting of another ellipse that would bring up another cylinder that we can use to build up her body up there. So I'm going to connect those like that. And so we can kind of understand the shape here like this, and then we can easily relate that back. So even if we don't draw those lines and let's say I erase all of those like this, and we hide the reference image, it will be easy for us to understand, okay, I can already kind of get an idea for how this leg should look without even, knowing exactly what the reference is or looking at it, just because I kind of have an idea or a feeling for how thigh should look. And so that looks pretty good to me. And when you're getting used to that, you can start to think and see in 3D, even though we're not drawing things that are there. So you can see exactly, this almost exactly fits it. And I have some of the worst memory, trust me. I'll have my phone in my pocket and forget that I have it there. But you can see once you're starting to get used to this, it becomes very easy to understand the flow. And so I've done several of these over the past few years, and it's really helped me out a lot. But I'm going to stay on this one because it starts to get a little bit tricky up here. So when you have clothes that are getting in the way, I recommend that you switch to shapes. So what I'm going to do here is, it's pretty easy to see this shape, however, this form. I can just simplify her arm there. Since we have the end of her sweater, it's pretty easy to visualize that as a ellipse. And then I'm going to visualize this as an ellipse. And then over here, I like to imagine like, a Barbie doll or a doll construction, how the elbow, if you've taken them apart, I know you have, I'm not the only one. If you've taken dolls completely apart, you'll know that the arm kind of ends up in that shape there. So I'm going to kind of visualize that curve coming back, kind of like a turned macaroni noodle. And I'm going to draw this cylinder coming back up like this and really emphasize those curves, because that's what's going to give our drawing a lot of energy when we copy this later. And so, but when we come back here, personally, I know, okay, I can kind of visualize that there's going to be another cylinder here, but you may not be able to do that. So what I would recommend is you focus on the shape. So, okay, I see a triangle shape here, so I'm going to emphasize that. And then over here, I see another triangle shape, so I'm going to emphasize that shape as well. It's kind of looking at this as negative and positive space. And over here, I see this shape coming and coming back up like that. And so I would use these as a way to really block out the form. And again, now we're going back to understand this as a cylinder coming back up through there. So I would just draw a curved cylinder like this, and that can help you kind of figure out that area until you can start to understand the major shapes that are coming down here that we talked about in the girl who was sitting on the white bench before. So this guy is in a really dynamic pose, which can be really difficult. For me, I know exactly my problem would be making sure that the distance between his chest here and where his legs start doesn't get too long. I have a tendency to do that a lot. And so when we're going to break this down into shapes, I'm going to kind of go off of what I know, but you can see a lot of his clothing is obscuring the forms that we can see. So why don't we go ahead and start with the forms that we know are there. So his head, I also want to pay special attention to, because this is really key. You know, when you're drawing a character like this, you want their head to be in the right perspective. So knowing how heads work, I'm going to draw a sphere. This is how I normally like to represent heads. And then again, you can look at it like this and draw the curved triangle like that. But in this case, I really want to make sure that we know what direction he's facing. So I'm going to represent his face as this shape that you see me draw here. This shape, the mask shape that I've coined my mask method from earlier videos, is this diamond shape there. And so that shape is what I'm going to use to kind of help place how his head is working here. So this is the top of the diamond, and then this is that corner, and then that corner is going to come down to the point there, and then the same thing would happen here, but since it's at an angle, it just comes off as one line. And so now I'm going to use this line to curve back around here, and then use an ellipse to kind of draw the cross section of his head where his eyebrows would be. And so that's how I naturally now understand heads. I like to draw a cross section where the eyebrow is, so I can understand the direction that the head is facing. And so this plane of the head is pretty much flat. We're going to pretend that that's a flat edge of a box right there, and then I'm going to draw another cross section here, and then that would be the other side. So if I hide this reference, hopefully you're starting to see this as this type of shape here, where there's a cylinder or an ellipse. It comes down like this, and then comes down like that. So this would be where the face sits, and then this would be where the ear sits, and then the head would come back around like this, like that. So it's a pretty complex set of forms and shapes, but it will help you to make sure your head is facing in the right direction right there. So this isn't exactly in the same perspective, but it still emphasizes the same things that I want you to pay attention to here. And you can see why it's still always good to start with a sphere, even though we're chopping the sides off to make it flat. So if I go on with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with the legs, because usually that's the easiest place. I'm going to draw these ellipses here, set up the cylinder. Just want to cut the cylinder off right below the knees. Have that cylinder right there, like this. So we're already understanding the proportion for his legs there. So here I can see a little bit of where his pants are, even though where his pants stop at his waist, even though his shirt goes down pretty far. So I'm going to use that and just set up a really big cylinder here to represent his waist. And so from there, what I'm going to do is just kind of imagine a shape that's going like this. This isn't anatomically correct at all. Your legs don't really do this. They usually, they're interrupted by your butt somewhere at some point. But I'm just going to draw this down just so I can understand the form and the energy that's going on here. And so I can identify this right here. So you can kind of visualize the sphere again for his knee. It's kind of like like a squashed sphere. And I'm going to draw an ellipse here to represent that end of the cylinder. And then so we can understand that curve going on here. I'm going to draw another cylinder like this. And remember that there's a squashed sphere right there for his knee. And then just bring that up. And then just extend that like that. And then here, I see there's a really, really tight crease here in the shirt. So that must be a division of where the form is. So what I'm going to do is kind of separate his torso into two parts to where he has this upper part like this, and this is the part that's facing towards us. And I'm just going to connect that as a cylinder like this. Boom. So it's helping me break down his movement and his energy into one shape that can help me inform my drawing later on. And so now I know his arm is going to connect into his torso. So I'm going to draw a big old cylinder or ellipse like this, just so that's where its arm connects. I don't see it here, so I'm just going to go ahead and draw a line right there just to simplify that, and here. And so now what I want you to start to see is there's this line coming down here. Hopefully this is going, ideally this would be going down his sternum, and then there would be a line here. This would be going down his navel. And so we can kind of visualize that twisting motion as well. And so that would be a simplification of his torso again. And this is basically just, you know, a box like this. Like that. This is random changing perspective lines, but hopefully you can get the idea. Where I would cut this out, I would just take a circle and just smooth that out. And then I'm going to take this edge and I would just kind of cut that shape out right there. And then I would make this bottom part an ellipse like this. So I would cut off those corners. And then I would draw a dotted line to represent the back of it. And so you see, it's really, really easy. You just take that basic shape that you understand, you add the parts that you need and subtract the parts that you need, and then you rotate it in space. And that's basically what we have here. It's really like this. But yeah, it's basically what we have here. And that's what I drew up here. So I can understand, okay, even if I were to think about lighting, if I know how to light a box, I know how to light this part where I decide where the light is in general, and then I can start coming back into the details and adding all of these wrinkles. And so if we go back up right here, you know, that's where the wrist, where his wrist starts, is probably going to be a lot smaller than that. And then we can see this is where his elbow is. Identify that bend. Actually, that elbow is almost exactly like right on the line of the camera, so that ellipse is going to be very thin, and then his arm is going back into space like that, so we're going to see a little bit more of that ellipse. And then we're going to draw the cylinder and then do the same thing here, and then we have that. And so if I hide the reference, you can see we're really understanding this shape. Not, you know, this definitely does not look like an anatomy drawing, but we're really starting to understand this. So when I wanted to draw my own right next to it, right after, my brain is going to be able to relate all of this quickly, and it's going to think that I'm drawing it myself from scratch, and it's going to basically start training itself to see things broken down into these kind of systems. And then we're going to really start being able to draw things like from reference really easily going forward. So I'm not going to lie, this one's going to be pretty tough, but I think it's really cool. This is something that I would want to draw for my own page and for my own entertainment, and then add all kinds of cool stuff to it. It's tricky because she's at a really interesting perspective. There's a lot of depth. You can see from the front of her foot right here going all the way back to that foot. You can see there's a lot of space like this. There's quite a bit of space if you look at that. And if I were to set up this image as a perspective drawing, you would see that the lines would most likely be doing something like that. It's almost like an extreme 1-point perspective. So the other thing that makes this tricky is because her shirt really hides almost all of her anatomy here in her upper body. So it can be really tricky to draw this if we're not really understanding how to combine shapes with form. So I'm going to start out with the foot right here. It's foreshortened. So we can see here that her ankle's bending in. So this cylinder here is going to start off like that, very thin, because it's going back up that way. And so here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to understand this as a box again, but I'm going to add a little bit more complexity to it, and then emphasize this curve. So basically I'm going to draw a curved box here. And so I'm going to start off here and draw this edge like that. And then I'm just going to draw the rest of it through it like there. And then the rest for the top part, I'm just going to have if you were to imagine, it's kind of hard for people who haven't worked in 3D programs to imagine this, but if you were to loft these two shapes, hopefully I might try to put a reference of what loft means, but if you were to try to smooth this ellipse and merge it into this one, you would get this smooth, like kind of net like that. And so if we hide the background, I would represent this as dotted line. This is kind of how I want you to visualize this, or how I would start. I would try to imagine this as a kind of net that's flowing down this way. And so any of the elements that I draw on it would be resting along that surface here. And so that's how I'd kind of break down the foot. We could go down further and then kind of subdivide that there, but I think that's enough for you to be able to understand the foreshortening, the proportions, and the form of it. And so when we go backwards, I'm going to go ahead and actually, since we have the sock here, just go ahead and draw an ellipse there. That way you know exactly how long the sock is, and it's actually changing her anatomy quite a bit because it's pinching in. We have this nice like anime stocking pinch here. So I'm going to draw another ellipse right here, right before her knee. That was actually a little bit wrong. I'm going to draw this part. So this is the part that we see. And yeah, a lot of these contours and drawing through are really going to be, not contours, cross sections are really going to be key for how we understand the forms moving forward. So strengthen this ellipse here. And then again, we're going to just connect this ellipse with that one using straight lines so that we can pay attention to what's happening with the anatomy there, so that when we want to draw this, we're like, okay, this is what's happening within this section here. We have this nice ankle part here. So if I were to draw this, I would really emphasize this angle here, and that would really give this drawing a lot of energy. Same thing going up with this part, top part. If I draw a straight line here, you see, okay, we see her calf muscle here. That's going to add a lot of interest to this, and we see that this is slightly bowing in. So that kind of gives you the illusion that you know what you're doing with your anatomy. And again, draw a sphere here. I'm not going to make it the entire size because I want it to look like it's being kind of smushed. Let's see, if I have this thing right here, you should think of the two cylinders of the knee kind of, or the thigh and the leg kind of smushing down to make the knee joint there. So that's what I'm going to do here. Draw another ellipse. And so this ellipse is actually going to cross over that way because we see that it's covering a lot of the mass of the thigh here. So I'm going to draw that ellipse quite a bit bigger, like that. And then so we see her thighs going back, but it's going to be hard to guess where that exactly intersects with her pelvis. But I'm just going to go along with what I see here. What the creases in the clothes are telling me is that this is going to be a point where things change. So I'm going to just estimate what that ellipse would be like here. And so going along with this curve, if you kind of use your knowledge in math, you know, if a curve is like this, then you know the rest of the curve is going to be this big. It's not going to be something like that, right? It's going to try to follow and be tangent with it. And so they actually almost touch. And then I'm going to draw a straight line here. If I were to draw a straight line here, you see that there's a lot that we're missing out on. You see she still has a lot of mass here, so we're going to curve that back. And in reality, the shape is probably doing something like that there. And then here we see her knee adds a little bit more shape up there. And then going back to her back foot, this is something I want you to understand. So what I would like to do here is actually represent the surface that her foot is making with the ground as an ellipse, and then do the same thing with this one. Even though this one is curved, I'm going to try to draw something that's at the same perspective and draw a line here that connects them, so I can get my brain thinking about this distance and keeping everything grounded. A lot of people who draw bodies that are standing or sitting, they tend to completely forget that they need to be grounded in the same perspective, and their feet need to connect with each other as they connect with the ground. And that's really key to making your drawings look believable. So I'm going to quickly try to establish that. And then I'm going to draw a little box and another cylinder here. I'm imagining basically this is what her shoe is, just representing it as like this sardine can that's touching the ground. And then we see here that there's another shape here. And so without kind of understanding, without really taking apart the anatomy of a shoe here, what I'm going to try to do is represent this as, I'm just going to use the design of the shoe to give me an idea of what's going on. So I'm going to use this curved triangular shape here, and then I'm pretty sure this is what's happening at the top. So I'm going to draw these two curved in edges here, and then a little bit like that. And then here, I'm going to use this curved edge to kind of use as the basis for another cylinder here. So since her foot is facing toward us, this ellipse is going to be really big compared to the one like this. And so here, this is getting really tricky since her knee is bent like this. I'm just going to represent the whole thing as a sphere in this case. And then I'm going to visualize an ellipse like this and then draw the straight lines there. We see that we're missing quite a bit. So now when I come back, I'm going to make sure to emphasize that this ellipse is coming down on top of it like that, and then draw straight lines there. And so when we're discovering things like this, we're keeping it in mind for when we do our own practice version. So when it comes to the shirt, I'm going to try to find as much form as I can, but I'm going to rely on shapes for the areas that I can't. So we see that there's this open hole here, easy, draw an ellipse there, draw an ellipse for her arm, and then we see that we can represent this area as a kind of ball shape here. And so I'm going to bring her arm back up using straight lines, and that's going to help inform me for when I want to do the wrinkles in her shirt. And so when I do a straight line here, we see that that really doesn't make sense with how her arm is moving. So we're going to pay special attention to add that curve back in and then connect this up here with the ball of her shoulder as well. Again, since we can see her arm, I'm going to add another ellipse like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and add one here like that to her arm, since that's the part that we're seeing that stops connecting. And I'm just going to bring that part up, flowing with the rhythm of her arm like that. And then so with here, I would just rely on shapes. So I'm going to notice, okay, there's this really straight shape, straight line that goes straight up like this. And then I'm just going to draw this curve back. It's almost like a straight line, to be honest. That's coming back this way. We see this wrinkle in the clothing, so I'm going to use that. And then I'm going to try and break this shape down. So I'm seeing this curve here where everything's creasing up as it starts to move forward towards us. So I'm just going to bring that shape down like that. And then another curve like there, like this, where it forms with her hip. And then just two shapes like this for her elbow, like that. And then, yeah, so that would pretty much be a good breakdown for how to approach this. And so you know a lot of it is going to be based on these legs, this energy, this rhythm right here, and then this one being really tight, and then her hip bringing up the rest of her body like that. With this one, I really want to get into the nitty gritty here and show you how I would break this down for myself with the torso. So in this kind of reference, I would use some stuff as basic shapes, but I would really want to get into the details when I get into her torso here. So instead of just breaking this down into shapes, I would want to use forms. So I would quickly try to identify, this is where you can kind of say this is tracing, I guess, but I would want to identify the center line. So I'm going to go down her sternum here, and then at the top of her rib cage, and then come back down to where her belly and her navel is. And then so from here, I'm going to identify, I see this planal surface here that's going down. So I'm going to use that as a cutoff point along with her bra that she's wearing, or tank top. And then I'm just going to draw an ellipse here. And then I'm going to draw a circle or an ellipse here. And then another one here, since I can see that that's the shoulder, and I'm going to kind of estimate that that's how that's connecting. And so I'm going to bring this down together like that, following that shape. And then I'm going to just bring this up here and then do the same thing with the front of the shape like that. And then I'd really want to try my best to visualize the side of it. So I'm really trying to represent this as a four-sided shape that's been cropped off on the sides to allow the elbows to fit into. And so I do the same thing here, except I'm identifying, okay, that her hips are starting to play. So what I would do here is I would draw an ellipse like this to represent where her belly's starting and where the forms of her ribs are starting to not emphasize the shape of the anatomy again, and then bring that down smoothly in towards like that. And then I'd use the shape, and I'm sure that her pants would probably be making this kind of shape like this if the Gucci bag wasn't in the way. So I'm going to bring that around and really try to emphasize that ellipse like that. And so here, I wouldn't pay as much attention to the forms, and I would focus on just simplifying this as two straight cylinders like that. Like this. And I bring this down Again, that's the other side of her waist there. Bring that down. Bring this up. Bring this up. And then I would just leave it like that there's these forms that become shapes, because a lot of this is just the clothing that's impacting this. And then so for her head, I want to get into this again. I'm going to draw a center line. I'm going to decrease the size of my pen there. Draw a center line. So her head is really this flat shape at the front, like this, right? Boom. So it's like this cutout shape here. And then we have this top area. So I'm going to draw this cylinder like this, or this ellipse. And then that's going to be her head, which is, you can imagine this is like the top half of a sphere. And then basically this whole part right here is just flat. If we go into the nitty gritty, there's really three sides to the face. There's the front side, this tertiary side here, and then this side is really the completely flat side. But we can just represent that as one shape once we get this cut in like that. And so that would represent her head. The cylinder of her neck would be fitting inside of it like that. You could draw another one here. This one's facing that way, and then it kind of curves like that and connect them. And so that's how I would break up her upper body like that. So with this one that I'm going to do, I'm going to try to go really elementary on you guys, which is going to be really helpful for some of you. So I want to draw very strict shapes and not curve them as much as I can. So I'm going to try to represent her body in rectangular prisms as much as I can so that you can really understand what's going on. Let me reduce the opacity here. If I come back up here, I'm going to take this area. I love using clothes as a way to divide things because they're naturally sectioned to be cut off at parts of the body that make sense, that are already pre-divided. And so I'm going to represent her torso as one box. And so this is kind of hard, but it's going to help you more in some ways when it comes to breaking down the body into basic forms, because you really have to be able to simplify this in advance before you actually pay attention to how it flows with the shape of her torso. So her torso here, I'm noticing that her neck would really fit in right there. And so I'm going to use that as a guide for how the top of this cube should look. So I'm going to use that line like this. And then I'm going to decide where the top of the cube is going to be. So I think this is actually going to be the middle. And then I'm going to draw a line here and then have this be the front of it. And then I'm going to draw this edge up like that. So I'm kind of solving for where I want this shape to be. And I am noticing that her rib cage is really expanding the top of her body. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to draw this as a kind of cubified trapezoid. So imagine a trapezoid shape that's been extended, extruded into a 3D form. And so I'm going to use that shape. It's still very strict. It's a strict shape. We're not going to make something curved with volume or ellipse cuts in it. And I'm just going to draw this back into space here, and then keep trying my best to keep the lines parallel. We don't want this to be an abstract shape. And then keep this parallel like that. And so you see, this is a very kind of classical shape. It doesn't really deviate too much. The only thing that does deviate is these angles. These need to be parallel. So I'm going to pick which one is the best estimate. I think this one is the best. And so I'm going to try to really copy that same line. You know what? I'm going to just go ahead and cut this and bring it up here. And we're actually pretty close already. So I was actually wrong. I was second guessing myself. But let's go ahead and see if it matches with this line though. It doesn't really. So I'm going to go ahead and erase that and make sure that this matches. And to help me out even further, I'm going to divide this here where her neck is. I'm going to bring this down, try to match the middle here, and then do the same thing here to help me really visualize the form of this box like that. And then I'm going to do the same thing with her pelvis, which is going to be really kind of tricky since her clothing is in the way a lot, but we do have this ellipse shape here to help us find the direction of where the top of this box is going to be. So I'm going to draw that in, then I'm going to try to represent this as a box. And so I recommend doing this method actually more than the others. I would say this is going to be a little bit more advanced, and it's really going to be what helps you be able to break things down faster and faster as you do more of these going forward. And for this, I'm actually going to kind of create a custom shape. Just judging from, you know, usually when you draw a torso and then the lower part of the body, the lower part is usually going to be bigger than the torso. So I'm going to go ahead and draw this line down like that. Now this shape isn't going to be very strict because naturally the pelvis is quite a different shape overall. And I'm going to take this down that way, trying to reduce this into a very simple shape that doesn't change in too many dimensions. I'm going to bring this down like this and bring that back like that. And so this is really capturing the rotation, it's capturing how she's kind of kicking her hip out backwards like this, and it's really going to help me going forward. I'm going to emphasize this ellipse and this one. I'm going to believe her knees are there, so I'm going to do another one here. And since this is a really interesting picture where the perspective is changing a little bit. And so we're seeing the top of her shoe here, but now we're also seeing the bottom of her face. So the perspective is, if you were to draw the perspective lines, it's kind of a curve here. It's a really interesting type of 3-point perspective. So this is going to be the top of the ellipse here, but over here, when I draw this one, you can see, again, this is pretty much going to be like that. But if I were to draw an ellipse here, it's going to be the top line here like this. And so this ellipse is kind of pointing up that way. And you can imagine this one is pointing down that way. So that's really somewhere in between here is where the perspective is starting to change. So I'm just going to do this like that. The same here. This one is pretty much pointing towards us. I have another ellipse there. This is basically just to help me make sure that I don't draw her legs too this is basically here just to make sure that I don't draw her legs too thin or too thick or too short, because it's pretty easy to just draw along with these curves of her pants there. You can't really mess up these kind of edges because, you know, they're pants, they're an organic form that really our eyes aren't going to be able to catch on to as being incorrect too quickly. I'm going to break this down like I did with the top shape. We can kind of visualize this like that. If you want to, you could have followed this shape closer, but I really want to try to teach myself and imagine what the body under these clothing is really looking like. And so here, I can take an ellipse here to show her neck, bring that down. And so now I've reduced this into a certain, it's just like, okay, so this is basically just like 5 shapes. And so I can really sit down and be as careful as I can to construct these shapes since I followed pretty strict rules, maintaining my parallel lines, my perspective. And so I can draw those and then I can come back and let's say I want to give myself a little bit of a hint of how to draw these arms. So what I would do is just, you know, draw an angle like this and pay attention to where that connects. And then let's say I wanted to draw just an oval for where her face is. And so that's really all I would need to really give myself a diagram. And so looking at this kind of looks weird. I would never draw this naturally if I were to compare it to this image. And so it really kind of helps force you to see, wow, her torso is actually really tiny compared to her legs and her waist and her hips. You can see her arm is really, you know, at a first glance, it feels like her arm should be a lot bigger, but it's really just right up there, ending at the top of her hip there. And you can see how small her face is compared to everything else and how much her hair contributes to things. So this is helping you kind of throw away what you think you know, because our brains tend to mess with things as we consider them important or not as important. And this really helps you start to understand how your shapes are working with things that you see, and kind of teach you to relearn yourself to see things as they really are.